So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ravi, and I'm the moderator for this session, QI Tools, When and How to Use Them. This session is being recorded, and it'll be available to all delegates after the conference, as are all the other sessions and talks. As a reminder, please, everyone, keep yourself on mute during the presentation so there's no background noise or anything. And I'd now like to introduce the lead for this workshop, Dr. Stephanie Meddick-Dyson, who is a palliative medicine trainee on the new dual curriculum and an active clinical academic. Having completed a quality improvement clinic course and gained valuable insights into how robust quality improvement knowledge can enhance various aspects of a medical career, she now mentors doctors on their quality improvement projects as part of the quality improvement clinic team. If you have any questions at all, please pop them in the chat and we'll do a little Q&A at the end. But now I will hand over to Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Ravi. Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a nice day so far. And if you're joining, just watching the recording, then thank you very much for taking the time to come back to catch up on this. I'm hoping today's session is going to leave you with some actionable tools that you can take away and put into practice. So please take notes as you see fit, ask questions as you want to, just pop them in the chat, as Ravi said, and we can get to them at the end. I don't have much to add to the introduction. Thank you, Ravi. I'm a palliative care doctor by background, and sort of a side passion of mine is helping people through their own quality improvement projects. And I learn so much by doing that and mentoring people through that it's really beneficial to do that, and hopefully I can share some of those lessons today. The one thing to add is that we have mentored some vets recently through the process, which has been eye-opening, very different to the doctors who do the courses. So without further ado, I shall get going. So the aims of this session are to help you use tools to hopefully be able to choose the one thing that you want to work on when thinking about a quality improvement project, how to properly get into the nitty-gritty of diagnosing the problem, and I'll allude to what I mean by that. And then right at the end, how do you determine if you've actually even made a change? So hopefully that's what the tools will help you to do. I'm going to start by sort of mirroring the clinical process that we all go through when we meet a new patient. So you don't see a patient in clinic or in the emergency department or in your GP surgery and immediately know what they need, what the problem is. You have to go through the process of the diagnosis. So you have to take the history, you have to think about what could be wrong with the patient, ask them, what can they tell you, what more information can they give you? And then you might do some diagnostic tests, so maybe some blood tests, some imaging, to gather some more information on that. And then you work together to sort of develop what's the treatment goal, what are we aiming to do here? And also, how am I going to know if I've met that goal? Do I want this patient to be completely pain-free? Do I want them just to be able to walk around their living room? What goal are we aiming for? And then with all that in mind, that's when you can start to make the treatment plan and you can put that into action. And then you need to get their feedback, don't you? Or you need to have a look at those tests to see whether the treatment that you've applied has actually worked. And then you can make a decision on that, whether you're going to continue the treatment or maybe pivot and change your approach. Is the treatment going to carry on working for this patient, or are you going to need to change that? And quality improvement process is really similar to that. So you might have come across a problem in your clinical practice or identified a problem through an audit that you know you want to change. And it can be quite easy to jump forward to thinking about what you already think might be the solution to that, and to just put that change in place. And then quite often that falls apart and it doesn't work. And it's because we haven't done those diagnostic stages. We haven't gone through the process to figure out really what is going on in this situation. What is the goal that we want to work towards? How do we know that we've met that goal? And then how do we do it? And those changes that have been developed through this robust process of quality improvement are the ones that last and are sustainable in clinical practice. And I bet if I asked any of you, I'm not going to, don't worry, to give me an example of where you've perhaps tried to make a change in clinical practice and it just hasn't lasted. People just haven't adopted that change, even if it was a really great one on the surface. And this process can really help to make sure we're making the right changes at the right time in the right ways. So I'm going to introduce something now called the model for improvement, and it really is what the quality improvement process sort of hinges on. It's a model that's in the literature and is referred to by a lot of QI professionals. Some of you may have seen it before. It's absolutely fine if you haven't. Lots of people, well, many people will know what this circle is at the bottom when we're talking about quality improvement, but maybe not those boxes at the top there. So we're just going to wake you up a little bit, and I just want to run a bit of a self-assessment for you here. So don't post anything in the chat just yet, but looking at that model, I want you to try and have a think. Could you fill in those boxes, and could you fill in each of the quadrants in this circle here? Depending on how many you think you could do at this moment in time, score yourself out of 7, which is if you know all of them. Then put that in the chat, and then in sort of 5 seconds or so, I'll ask you to press go. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so if you've typed it in, just press go now and let's see how many people got. Like I said, I'm expecting lots of zeros and it's absolutely fine. That's good, we've got some coming through. Oh, some 7s. I'll go home then, shall I? Please don't feel influenced by what other people have said. Like I said, it's absolutely fine if you've not seen it before. Lovely, so a bit of a mix. Ravi's joined in as well, excellent. Okay, so I've got some 4s and some 7s, quite a lot of 7s, good, good. Well, I'm not spending too long on this bit, so you will still get something from this talk, thankfully. And I'm going to assume that the 4s are maybe the circle at the bottom. I could be wrong, but that is usually what we see. Okay, I'm just going to move on. So I'm going to give you the spoilers now. So I'm not going to ask you to tell me if you were right or wrong. You can just sort of self-reflect on that. But this is the model for improvement as it stands. So we've got that PDSA cycle at the bottom, which somebody helpfully put in the chat. Thank you. And that's the plan, do, study, act. But then before that, we've got a process by which we have to develop our aim. So what is it that we want to achieve? How are we going to measure that we've achieved that aim? And then we move on to thinking about the change ideas. I think often in practice, this can come sort of all muddled up and those change ideas creep forward. And at Quick Learn, we try and teach people to sort of park those change ideas. I remember when I did my first project, I had to have a literal car park drawn out on a piece of paper to put my change ideas in, because I was so keen to just get going and do it. So this is just a bit more information on the PDSA cycle that's clearly lots of you have seen before, but some of you may not have. So these are the crux of quality improvement. They're the small cycle tests of change that we make at the end of the process once we've sort of determined our change ideas. And the P is for plan. So you plan what you're going to do when you're conducting your test to make your change. You do the test and you record what happens when you do it, so that you can then study those effects. You can study the observations that you've made, and then you can make a decision on how you're going to act on those. And often in quality improvement projects, we can see upwards of sort of 4 PDSA cycles. I've seen them with sort of 30 PDSA cycles sometimes. And the beauty of it is that those they are small cycle tests of change. So you can do them over hours even if you want to. I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about this bit though, which is often what's overlooked. So before we even get onto that model for improvement, we've got to think really carefully and in depth about the problem. What is the problem? And we need to go into those diagnostics. So we come back to this journey that I talked about before, and I just want to highlight that these first 3 boxes that explore and discover the diagnostic process are really in my opinion, the most important part of the quality improvement project. And that's just mapping the model for improvement against that there. So you can see these 3 boxes are about the problem. Then we can move on to the aim, measure, and change ideas. And then finally, we move on to the PDSA cycles. And today's talk, I'm going to use these parts of the journey to talk through the tool. So I'm going to give you a tool for finding your one thing, for sort of finding your problem. I'm going to give you 3 tools for diagnoses, which is sort of highlights the importance of that, I think. And then I'm going to go through how you can tell whether you've made a change. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to be able to read this poster, but just to sort of contextualize what I'm talking about, I'm going to draw on an example from one of the doctors who did one of our QIC courses and I mentored through. Sophie is a geriatrician and has given me permission to use her work because I think it's an excellent example of using these tools throughout QI project. So hopefully it just sort of brings it into real life context for you. Okay, so arrow 1, if you think you've got a problem, and you might come across your problem just in your clinical day-to-day work. It might be something that's really frustrating for you. Maybe a blood test keeps getting missed or something is taking a lot longer than you think it should. So you may have identified it that way. You may have identified something that needs to change through an audit process. And the workshop that you will go on to after this with Nikki is going to talk a bit more about that. So how do you use those audit findings to springboard a quality improvement project? And that can be a really great way to sort of transition from that traditional sort of audit culture that medicine has sort of come from into quality improvement. So we use this tool called Choose One Thing, and it's a bit of maths, but very simple maths. And essentially what you have to do is list all of those things that you think are standing in the way of that great care, and then you score them in these 3 columns. So the first one asks sort of how important is that problem? The second one asks, can you fix it? Is it within your sphere of influence, or is it something that's completely outside of it? So for example, is this the job of the hospital manager? In which case, unless you are the hospital manager, you're probably not going to be able to influence that change. And then the last box is about your motivation. So how important is it to you? How much do you care about it? Because if you're going to embark on doing a project, it needs to be something that you actually want to change and care about. And the most important bit on this slide is that the scores are multiplied. So if any of your ideas, any of the things that you think are standing in the way score a 0, then your end total will be 0. And that's really important. So again, to bring it back to life, I want to tell you about Sophie's project. So Sophie was thinking that she is seeing lots of people on her geriatric wards that weren't getting the nutrition that they needed. That was her main concern. She thought great care was that people are getting the nutrition and the sustenance that they need to get better and improve from their illnesses. And that's not what she was seeing. So if you look at the first line here, one of her sort of thoughts, hypotheses, if you will, was that the patients are not able to reach their food and drink. So that's why they're not able to eat it. So she thought, how much better would patient care be if she could fix that? So if patients were able to reach their food, and she thought actually that would have a great impact. So she scored it a 2. She thought, can she fix it? So she's a consultant geriatrician. I think she was a senior reg at the time, but is a consultant now. And so she felt single-handedly she's not going to be able to fix that problem. She can't go around and move everybody's dinners closer to them. But with her team, she felt that she could. It definitely wasn't outside of her sphere of influence because it was her ward that she works on. She knows the team well, and she really felt that she could sort of make an impact that way. And she was really motivated. She brought this to the table because it was something that really frustrated her. And she really felt that it impacts those long-term outcomes for her patients. So she times 2 by 1 by 2 to get 4. She didn't add 2 to 1 to 2 to get 5. She times them, she multiplied them. And if that had scored a 0 in any of those, then it would have got a 0 in this last column. And she would have decided, actually, that's not something that's practical to take forward for a project. And as you can see, she's sort of listed different ideas down in the first column here. And for example, if you'd had a 4, a 2 and a 0 at the end, it would be really easy to then think, right, well, the 4 is obviously the most important project to take forward. But if you've got a couple of 4s, then obviously you need to sort of go through and decide for yourself what you think is going to be best, or use some of the other diagnostic tools. So maybe have a think about how you might use that for your quality improvement ideas. And sometimes it can be quite surprising to do this. So you might think that it's a great idea to take forward for a project, but actually when you sit down and you think, actually somebody else recommended this project to me and I don't really care for it, and I'm probably not going to want to stay that extra half an hour after work or whatever to collect the data. So if it's going to get a 0 in that last column, then it's probably not the project to be taken forward for you. So once you've identified your one thing, we advocate the use of something called a problem statement, which is essentially your way to shout about the problem and really convince other people that it is a problem. And there's a few rules or suggestions that we use around problem statements to help you do that. So it goes without saying, it would be better to be short and sweet and to the point. Try and use everyday language, no abbreviations, which we're terrible for in medicine. And really try and make it as impactful as possible. Use those sort of impactful words. And this is Sophie's for an example. So she said, patients' food and drink is often not in reach. Those with cognitive impairment are less likely to ask for help. Every day, every drink, every snack, and every meal are important for patients at risk of weight loss and malnutrition. Weight loss results in increased risk of medical complications and death. And I would maybe play devil's advocate there and say that cognitive impairment is quite a medical term, and we could probably tweak that to get that a bit better. But you can see there as an example, that's quite an impactful statement. You could even just use that second part, every day, every drink, every snack, and then weight loss results. So you want the consequences of that. Hopefully that illustrates the sort of impact of a problem statement, really short and sweet, and just allows you to communicate with people outside of your project. Why are you bothering with this? Why are you asking them to help you? Okay, so now you've identified your problem, and the tool to do that was the choose one thing, and you've got your problem statement to help you to communicate your problem. We move on to the diagnostics, which is where we really dig into the cause of the problem and what we can possibly change going forward. And this is where these tools come in to help. So I'm going to talk through these. I'm going to talk through a process map, which is essentially what it says on the tin. I'm going to talk through a fishbone diagram, which may be a bit more foreign to people, but some of you might have seen those before. And then I'm going to talk about how you can use a bar chart in your diagnostic process. And again, I'm going to use Sophie's project as an example. So this was Sophie's process map. So at the end, she knew that she wanted a patient to maintain the weight, and at the start of their journey, they were admitted to hospital. Those are the sort of start and end of the process map. And she went through, and these often take a few iterations because you forget things or you add in unnecessary things. You want it to be really high level and just have those sort of important steps through the process. So she said that sometimes patients are admitted to hospital, it can be really clear and obvious that they are malnourished or they are losing weight. And so therefore they then get a nutrition plan implemented, but ultimately they need to be able to reach that food and drink in order to maintain their weight. Sometimes it's a bit more convoluted and it's not super obvious, but when you do their MUST score, so their malnutrition, it's hard to say, universal screening tool, then maybe it identifies that they need their nutrition closely looked at. If they have cognitive impairment, for example, or if the family are really concerned, they say, they've lost 10 kilos in the last year. Those are other ways that it can be identified. But ultimately, right before they're able to maintain weight, they have to be able to reach their food. And so for Sophie, this highlighted again the importance of that as a problem to take forward. She did a fishbone diagram that looked at the contributions of malnutrition in hospital. So she put that at the head of the fish here. If you can imagine, this looks like a fish. It does to me. Hopefully it does to you. And then the different spokes, the fish bones that are going in there, are to really dissect down what is contributing to that problem. So for malnutrition of patients with cognitive impairment, for example, the people-related factors may be that they don't have the right education around nutrition, or maybe they don't have the training to be able to identify that. You can see on there lots of examples. And the food and drink not in reach came under the environment. But it may be that Sophie looked at a different aspect of this fishbone diagram. And even at this point, when she's done those first parts of her diagnostics, she might change her mind. She might get here and then maybe she brainstormed this fishbone with the team, and the team were really clear that actually that's not a problem to them on the ground. They do not think that that is impacting patients' weight management. What they think is something else, that the tables are really difficult to move, and that's why, so you have to take that into account. Alternatively, she could have used the fishbone in this way. So she could have identified her problem and said, right, my problem is that the food and drink is not in reach. I'm going to put that at the head of my fish, and I'm going to really break that down into why is that happening. So maybe it's people just don't think it's important for people to be able to reach their food and drink. So they don't really prioritize moving it close to the patient. Maybe it's within reach to you and I, but to a patient who has poor vision, they can't quite see it that far away. And although we could maybe pull it just slightly closer, maybe their mobility limitations means that they can't do that. And these fish bones can help you to figure out the aspects that you might be able to change and ones that you can't. So after that, this brings you to your bar chart. So if Sophie had got to this point and she thought there were quite a few things on that fishbone that I could maybe focus on, and actually the group told me that there were other things that I should be looking at, that's a perfect time to use a bar chart, and it just quantifies the problem. So what she did was she counted the number of patients who had these reasons here for not being able to have their weight monitored effectively, and she put the percentage of patients in a really simple bar chart, and she could see that actually the issue wasn't that people weren't having their must scores documented or their weights documented. The issue really was that they weren't able to reach their food and drink. That was a big problem with 85% of her patients on the ward round not being able to reach their food and drink. So she had all the evidence she needed really to move forward. And I think it can be quite difficult in a QI project to take the time to do these steps and to really delve in and diagnose the problem. But you can see that if at any of these stages Sophie had got evidence to the contrary, that actually that wasn't the thing to be focused on, she would then have lots of opportunity to switch it. And it means that her project overall is going to be a lot more meaningful. So we've talked about the problem, and hopefully I've hammered home that that is the most important part to be focusing on and using those tools. And I'll give you some QR codes for some YouTube videos that go over those tools again, because it's a lot to take in. I don't expect you to be able to walk away from this workshop today and be able to just sit down and use a fishbone or sit down and use a bar chart. Sometimes it takes a little bit of fathoming how it would work for your project. So those YouTube videos are really helpful. But once you've done that, we can move to the next part of the improvement model, which is your aim and measure. And I'm not going to talk about these as tools as such, but I just wanted to touch on them and the importance of them and a few things to think about. So you absolutely would have heard of SMART aims by now. You're probably sick of hearing about SMART aims, but you want to have SMART aims. You need to have an aim that is specific, that says, who are you talking about? Who are you looking at? So Sophie had clearly said she's looking at her patients with cognitive impairment. So she sort of excluded those who didn't have cognitive impairment. She wants it to be measurable. So that brings you on to thinking about your measure. Realistic. So again, that brings you back to something, can you actually make the change? And then is it realistic in the time frame as well? So there's multiple aspects to that aim, and you want it to be clearly defined when you write that down. And it might take a few iterations to get there, and that's okay. You might start by saying, I think I want to do this, and then by the end of your process, you've got a nice clear aim, as Sophie did here. And the measure, you need to think about, the most important question really is, does the measure reflect what the changes I'm actually trying to make? So these pictures of the sheep here are to illustrate that I could tell you that there are 3 sheep in every one of those pictures, whereas you may disagree with me. You may say there are 2 sheep and a baby sheep, a lamb. I forgot what baby sheep was called then, and a lamb in the second picture. Or you may say there are 4 sheep in the third picture if you are going to count lambs as sheep. You may say maybe one of the sheep in the first picture is pregnant, so therefore then what could be 4 there. So you want to make sure that that measure is nice and clear for everybody who is going to either help you collect that data or who is reading your work after, or you are presenting it to. So Sophie decided that she was going to go on the ward round each day and document the percentage of patients who had their food and drink in reach when they got there. Okay, so we've diagnosed the problem, we've talked to aim and measure, and now we're on to the change ideas and the PDSA cycle that we often just zoom ahead to. So I'll bring you back to this just as a reminder. This is what the PDSA cycle looks like. So how do we know that we've actually made a change? When we've planned our change, we've done it, and now we want to study it. So we use something called a run chart. And I've left a bit more time just to talk about this because they can feel quite overwhelming, I think. And there's a video that you can watch as well to talk you through run charts. So please don't worry if it sounds like I'm talking a different language when it comes to these. They can be a bit baffling to get your head around, but when you do, they're such useful tools, and hopefully I can explain it in that way. So you would usually start a quality improvement project by collecting some baseline data. And it's really important we get that baseline data because we need to know what the status quo is before we get involved. And often that can be forgotten if people jump into those change ideas straight away and we don't get an accurate picture of what life was like before any changes. And actually, even talking about a quality improvement project can, as you can imagine, can stimulate change, especially in a clinical environment. It may make people perform better on certain things if they know that you're watching, and that's called the Hawthorne effect. So collecting that baseline data before any of those conversations happen can be quite challenging, but is quite important. And we usually say you just need 20 data points. So that doesn't have to be 20 days. It's just 20 data points. So on this case, Sophie did do days. She did ward round days. So for 20 days, she collected the percentage of patients who had their food and drink in reach, and she documented them in a graph like this. And then what you do with that baseline data is you calculate the median and you plot that line. Now that line never changes throughout the project. And I think that's the key point here with the run chart. That median is supposed to give you a line that gives you a reference to see how well or how not so well you are impacting that change. The median doesn't change every time you add a data point, which is sometimes what we see happening. So if you imagine you tried to take the median of this set of data here, of the green line, that median would be sort of much higher halfway across the page, maybe not quite half, but it needs to stay where it was for the baseline data. So for you, I said you might not need 20 days, you might need 20 patients. So if you look at 5 patients every day, for example, you'd only need to collect that baseline data for 4 days, but you would have those data points to start with. And then you can implement your change, do your first PDSA cycle. So on this graph here, PDSA 1, I'm hoping you can see that it's really quite small, where this first blue arrow is here, is where Sophie made her first change. And this was where she went to the MDT and she presented the project. So she wanted to see whether just talking about it with the multidisciplinary team would make a change. And you can see, hopefully, just above the blue arrow, there was a little increase in number of patients who had their food in reach, but this quickly just dipped back down under the median. So she was able to see, when she's studying that in her PDSA cycle, she was able to say, okay, well, it did make a change, but it wasn't a lasting change. So what else do we need to do here? So she moved on to her second PDSA cycle, which was to involve the catering team. So she went and spoke and presented the project to the catering team because she thought, well, the more people I can get involved, the better. And again, there was a slight increase, not so much of an increase actually, and then it dipped back down again. So her PDSA 3 after that, she adapted the materials that she was presenting for people for whom English wasn't their first language, to try and include other members of the team who perhaps had been missed earlier on. She then employed some in-reach champions. That was her PDSA cycle 4, where she had people on the ward who were volunteers, and they acted as champions for the project, and they went round and they checked whether patients had their food in reach. And you can see there that that's when the green line really stays above the red line, which is the median. And that's called a run. That's a run of success, essentially. And that's why it's called a run chart, because you're able to see when you have a run above the median, that's when you've got some sort of impactful, lasting change. So hopefully that has explained run charts well enough. So you just need that baseline data. We usually say 20 points. You set your median on that, and then you've got your reference point there to record your PDSA cycles against. And essentially you would keep going with your project if you can, until you have that sustained change and you can evidence that. And if you think in Sophie's context, she had sort of achieved that change by having those champions in, but she thought, okay, how do I make that lasting? Are those champions always going to be there? How else can I sort of add to that? So her next PDSA cycle was for the doctors to check on ward rounds, so she added them in. She then added the housekeeper in and asked them to check. And then she asked the nutrition linked nurse to check. So she essentially had the whole team on board, and that is what created the lasting change. And I think her next plan after that was to add in some stickers, which is often what we see, but it's good that they were sort of far down the project. So that was a whistle-stop tour of tools for quality improvement. I haven't exhausted all of the tools that are out there because there's just not time to do so. And this is already a lot of information for you to take and a lot of talking for you to listen to. But this is just a summary of what we've talked through. So if we come back to this quality improvement journey, if you mirror that with your patient journey, you have to identify a problem by choosing your one thing. You have to articulate that problem using your problem statement. You then want to really delve into diagnosing it. And I suggested 3 tools by which you can do that. I talked about your high-level process map. So really looking at the steps that happen in a process and maybe identifying where things might be going wrong. I talked about using a fishbone diagram, where you put your problem at the head of the fish, and all those bones adding into the head are the potential things contributing to that going wrong. And then I talked about the bar chart, which is where you can put into numbers the extent of the problem, and that can help you pick apart and decide, when there's so much to measure, what do we choose to measure? And then finally, I just wanted to talk about run charts, because that is the epitome of how we know whether we're making a difference. That's that study part of the PDSA cycle. So I hope that was helpful. As I said, it was very quick. Ravi's just going to post a link in the chat now. I'd be really grateful, because we like to learn. This is part of our sort of quality improvement process. Can you just add to, if you click the link, it should take you to a website with some post-it notes. If you feel able to, just add 1 or 2 post-it notes each. So you don't have to add one to all of these, but just tell me about maybe a light bulb moment. Tell me about something that was fun to learn, something that I could have done a lot better, that was a best fail, or that was a bit of a struggle. That would be really helpful. And while you're doing that, these are the QR codes for the YouTube videos about the process map, the bar charts, and the fishbone diagrams. So I'll leave those up there, and we'll just see if there are any questions.
Yeah, looks like there's a few questions coming in. Well, first of all, thank you, Stephanie, for the presentation. It was really interesting. So the question is there a tool to help with coming up with change ideas?
So our tool for change ideas is essentially a blank paper. blank piece of paper. And the best that there are no silly ideas. The best thing to do is to try and think as far outside the box as possible when you're thinking about change ideas, and involve as many people as possible. So we literally, the tool that we provide is just a sheet that has a blank box, and we just say, start writing. I think I'm a big a fan of pen and paper when it comes to things like this. So just start writing your change ideas, what you think might happen, what you think might help, and then think really outside the box. So we give an example of there is a cup of a drink that you need, and it's the other side of the grass that you need to get to, and there's a sign that says you can't go over the grass. So we ask people to think about their ideas to get to that drink. How might you get there? And people start by things like, oh, just break the rules and run over the grass. And then someone else says, ask somebody to fetch it for you. And then as you leave people to think, and as people are sort of soundboarding ideas of each other, they start to come up with things like develop a jetpack or ride your bike. It doesn't say anything about riding your bike over the grass, or go all the way around, or develop a really long arm. People start to think outside the box, and those are the ideas that can be really exciting. So get your MDT involved with that. But that's the tool that we give, because I think that's the best way to come up with them.
Someone suggested a slightly alternative way of finding solutions where you may ask a question, how do we make things worse? It's an interesting way of thinking about things.
Yeah, I like that. I've not heard of Triz. I'll have to have a look at that. But it's like the reverse engineering, isn't it? There's a sort of a lot of thought about that in terms of, what are your goals in life can be really overwhelming. But if you think about what you don't want to be or who you don't want to be, then that can be really helpful to guide you. And I guess it's the same concept. Thank you. It looks like Jennifer's used Triz before as well. I'll have to have a look at that. Thank you. And Jennifer said, as clinicians, we're used to doing, yes, absolutely, aren't we? We're so used to just going straight in for those change ideas, and it can be so difficult. And often when we're running our courses, that's our main role, is to sort of hold people back. And it's not until the end of the course where they start to reflect, actually, yeah, that was the right thing. And certainly when I was the other end and I was doing the course, I was getting so frustrated with being held back, and I just wanted to make those changes, but they just wouldn't have been so impactful. So hopefully that's the message that we've got across. 4N's problem understanding tool. Thank you, Andrea. There's another one. Lots of tools. Any other questions? We've just got a few minutes left. I'll just see if I can see if anybody's popped anything in there.
Yeah, there's a few things on the ideas board. People are keen to sort of try the choose one thing process, and also are happy. You talked about sort of the diagnostics element, and also identifying a problem and how much you can influence it. The grid that you had there.
Yeah, and
I
that
appreciated you're talking about run charts, because it's something that's already come up in workshops today.
has it.
Using run charts to show you results as opposed to bar charts or pie charts or anything like that. So
Yeah, and they can be a bit mind-boggling to get your head around, but they once you can, and I think someone's written that as the golden nugget there. Once you understand that median is based off the baseline data, and then that's how you compare your change, they suddenly seem very simple. But if your median is moving, then they could get very confusing. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. I do hope that was useful. I will just move on to this slide just because my email address is up there. I'm always happy to answer any questions if you have any, or if you want to know more about the courses that we run or other options to learn. But do take a look at those YouTube videos just to consolidate some of the knowledge should you want to. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.